This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Saturday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Saturday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Saturday. Saturday, bring it on.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, I'm going to read you an original short horror story written by Josh Bell. He's the host of 2 terrific podcasts, Real Talk and Real Talk Horror. You can find both wherever you stream shows. So sit back, turn down the lights, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I read The Shadow in the Pines by Josh Bell. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. The Shadow in the Pines. Melanie's fingers gripped the steering wheel as her old station wagon hummed along the winding road. The blare of horns and gray haze of exhaust from the city faded farther into the distance with each mile. The sun dipped low, casting a warm golden light that flickered through the trees lining the road. Long reaching shadows stretching across the pavement like grasping fingers. The air inside the car had grown cooler, despite the warmth of the setting sun, carrying hints of pine and earth. Yet, beneath it lingered something else, something faintly metallic, like rain on rust. After weeks of endless deadlines, late-night phone calls, and the suffocating buzz of the city, this weekend getaway felt like salvation. The cabin in the woods, tucked away far from the noise, promised a sanctuary, A chance to breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on her. No emails, no meetings, just the stillness of the forest and the whisper of leaves. She didn't even care that her phone wouldn't have service. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled into the parking lot at Clearwater Campground. The station wagon gave a reluctant sputter and a cough before falling silent. But in that silence, something else filled the space. An odd, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. Melanie froze for a second, listening. But as soon as she noticed it, the sound was gone. She stepped out and stretched, inhaling deeply as crisp, pine-scented air flooded her lungs. A light breeze stirred the towering pines around her, their branches swaying gently. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the tranquility settle over her. But as the wind shifted, it carried something with it, a whisper too faint to name, yet it curled into her ear with an unnatural closeness, like breath against her skin. It almost sounded like her name. A shiver danced along her spine, but she shook it off, brushing away the unease as easily as a stray leaf on her sleeve. This was her weekend. Nothing would disturb it. Melanie grabbed her backpack, a small smile curling on her lips as she looked toward the cabins. Cabin 12, the one she had reserved, stood at the far end of the trail, nestled between the trees. It was exactly the kind of rustic retreat she had hoped for. Quiet, remote, and far from the hustle of daily life. She couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement at the prospect of spending the weekend in this cozy hideaway, away from everything. It was time to recharge, time to slow down, time for her to be herself again. She'd felt a wave of excitement when she first heard about the remote location. But now, suddenly, the isolation felt more oppressive than liberating. The caretaker's warning echoed in her mind as she started down the narrow path. Stay inside after dark, and don't go looking for anything that sounds out of place. The man had looked at her with eyes like flint, his gaze steady, almost too steady. He spoke with the air of someone who wasn't joking, though she chuckled awkwardly at the time, dismissing it as a small-town superstition designed to spook city folk. Still, there had been something in his tone, something unshakable, as if he was less concerned about her safety and more resigned to what might happen. Melanie put her backpack on and locked the car doors behind her, the caretaker's words replaying in her mind once more. She told herself she didn't believe in campfire tales or whispered warnings. But as night continued descending, she found herself hesitating, listening for something she couldn't name. The forest seemed to press in around her as she walked. Shadows stretched and shifted, creating shapes that danced just outside her field of vision. Every step on the dirt trail was muffled, yet she could hear the rustle of leaves far off in the trees, faint and intermittent, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. Melanie quickened her pace, the cabin coming into sharper focus as the twilight deepened. By the time she reached the cabin door, her hands were trembling slightly, though she told herself it was from the cool air. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking the switch near the frame. A single bulb flickered to life, casting a dim, yellow glow over the sparse interior. The cabin was exactly as she expected, rustic and worn, with a narrow bed, a small table and chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. Yet, there was an odd stillness to it, as though the space had been waiting for her arrival. Melanie trudged down the narrow dirt path, her flashlight slicing through the encroaching darkness like a fragile blade. The towering trees loomed on either side, their gnarled trunks twisting in unnatural shapes. The silence was too thick, too absolute. No insects hummed, no nightbirds called. Just the sound of her own breath and the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the damp earth. Every step seemed to echo, as if the forest were listening. Then, movement. A rustle, faint and intermittent, somewhere deep among the trees. She stopped. The sound stopped too. Her pulse quickened, throat tightening as she strained to see past the tangle of shadows. The flashlight's beam wavered in her trembling grip. She forced herself forward, quickening her pace. The crisp scent of pine was thick in the cold air, but beneath it, something else clung, faintly metallic like rust, or something worse. Her breath came faster, misting in the night air as the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her back. Then, it came. A growl, low, guttural, wrong. It reverberated through the trees, deep and resonant, vibrating in her ribs. It wasn't the bark of a dog or the distant howl of a coyote. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. Her breath hitched. She swung the flashlight wildly, its beam lurching over roots and underbrush, illuminating nothing but shifting shadows. The air felt tighter, the trees pressing in closer, the night itself holding its breath. She picked up her pace, boots scraping against gravel as she neared the cabin. The thought of 4 walls, a door she could lock, was suddenly all that mattered. Her fingers fumbled for the key, slipping once before she forced it into the lock. The door groaned as it swung open, and she stumbled inside, kicking it shut behind her. She pressed her back against the wooden door, exhaling sharply. The silence inside was almost suffocating, thick and expectant. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit cabin, just as she had left it, just as it should be. Yet something about the space felt unsettled. She swallowed hard, pulse still thrumming in her ears. Probably just an animal, she whispered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. Her words felt feeble, swallowed by the night. The growl had stirred something inside her, a sense of vulnerability she couldn't shake. The cabin's interior was just as she remembered, Spartan and unwelcoming. A narrow cot with a threadbare blanket stood in one corner, next to a rickety table bearing the scars of countless knife marks. A wood-burning stove squatted near the back wall, its surface dusty and unused. A single kerosene lamp on the table cast a weak, flickering light that barely kept the darkness at bay. Dusty motes floated lazily in the air, stirred by her movements and gleaming in the lamplight like tiny sparks. Melanie dropped her bag onto the table, the heavy thud breaking the oppressive quiet. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the worn wood, trying to steady her breathing. The unease that had gripped her on the trail refused to release its hold. Her heart raced, a relentless drumbeat in her chest. Her fingers brushed against the flashlight, still clutched in her other hand, and she realized how tightly she'd been gripping it. The knuckles of her fingers ached, the skin white and bloodless. She set it down and exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus on her surroundings. The cabin was a sanctuary, or so she tried to convince herself. But the growl, that low, inhuman sound, lingered in her mind like a warning she couldn't afford to ignore. Somewhere outside, A branch snapped. The hours dragged on like a slow, relentless tide. Outside, the wind wound through the trees, its voice carrying an eerie cadence that rose and fell like a mournful chant. The faint creak of the cabin's wooden beams added to the symphony of unease. Melanie tried to anchor herself in the pages of a novel, but the words swam into meaningless shapes as her thoughts churned. Her mind replayed the sound, low and guttural, like a predator's warning. She whispered to herself that it was nothing, just the wilderness, just her imagination painting shadows into monsters. But then, just after midnight, the sound came again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. Melanie froze as the growl rumbled through the thin cabin walls, a sound so visceral it seemed to vibrate in her chest. Her hands trembled as she set the book aside and crept to the window. The worn wooden floor groaned beneath her weight, betraying her every step. Holding her breath, she parted the curtains just enough to peer outside. The moonlight painted the forest in silver and black, shadows rippling as the trees swayed in the restless wind. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. Then, a movement, a flicker at the edge of the clearing. She squinted, her heart hammering. At first, the figure seemed like a trick of the light, but as it emerged from the tree line, Melanie's stomach clenched in primal fear. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs that moved in unnatural, disjointed jerks. Its skin was pale and stretched thin, like old parchment illuminated from within. When its head tilted, the angle was wrong, a grotesque mockery of human motion. But it was the eyes that pinned her to the spot, glowing orbs of molten gold. They burned through the darkness, locking onto her with a focus that made her blood run cold. They weren't just looking at her. They were seeing her, as though peeling back layers of her being. Melanie stumbled back, yanking the curtains as if the flimsy fabric could shield her from the creature's gaze. Her heart thundered against her ribs, each beat echoing in her ears. The growl came again, deeper this time, a sound that reverberated through the cabin and rattled the windows. It was followed by movement, deliberate, shuffling steps that crunched the brittle leaves outside. And then, the knock. One, slow, deliberate. The sound froze Melanie in place. A second knock followed, louder, heavier, each impact resonating through the small cabin like a drumbeat of doom. Her gaze darted to the fireplace. The rusted fire poker sat within arm's reach, its iron surface glinting faintly in the dim light. She lunged for it, gripping it with both hands, the cold metal biting into her palms. Suddenly, the kerosene lamp on the table flickered and dimmed, its light sputtering as if some unseen force had sapped its strength. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, and a faint, distorted voice echoed in her mind. Not in the room, but within her very thoughts.
Why do you hide?
The voice was guttural yet strangely articulate, its tone laced with a mocking curiosity. Melanie's grip on the fire poker faltered, her hands trembling as the weight of the voice bore down on her. "Go away!" she screamed, her voice raw and breaking. Though she wasn't sure if the words were spoken or merely thought. The presence didn't retreat. Instead, the voice came again, resonating deeper this time.
Do you not see? You belong to this night. You belong to me.
The temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. Melanie's breath came in visible puffs as a strange hum vibrated through the room. The fire poker in her hands grew warm, then searing hot, forcing her to drop it with a gasp. It clattered to the wooden floor, leaving a faint, glowing imprint behind. From outside, the shuffling steps halted. The knock came once more, sharp, deliberate, and final. The air grew still, the oppressive silence heavier than the sound. Melanie's pulse pounded as she staggered back, pressing herself against the far wall. She could feel it now, not just hear or see, but feel the creature's presence, an ancient and overwhelming force that seemed to weave through her very being. Then, as abruptly as it began, the sensation vanished. The frost melted from the windows, the air warmed, and the lamp's flame flared back to life. Melanie collapsed to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. The silence of the cabin returned, but this time it felt like a hollow shell, as if something vital had been stolen from the space. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time had lost its meaning as Melanie huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching the now cold, iron fire poker to her chest as if it were a lifeline. The lamp began to dim again, this time empty of the fuel needed for life. The knocking had ceased, but the silence that replaced it was deafening, suffocating her with its weight. Her heartbeat thrummed in her ears, each beat louder than the last. A chill crept over her skin, the air in the room growing thicker, heavier with each passing second. Then, like a nightmare slowly unfurling, a scraping sound sliced through the stillness. It came from the window. Melanie's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, dreading what she might see. Flicking on her flashlight, it sliced through the suffocating darkness, fleetingly revealing the jagged edge of the window pane, where the curtain hung crookedly, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond. Her pulse quickened. Then she saw it. Claws, long and jagged, dragging down the glass with an agonizing slowness, leaving behind streaks of something dark and wet. Her fingers tightened on the fire poker, but her limbs were frozen, as though her body no longer obeyed her. Her throat constricted as a blood-curdling scream tried to claw its way up, but she choked it back. She couldn't make a sound. Not yet. Then, the face appeared. Pressed against the corner of the window, its features twisted and grotesque. Its skin was pale and pulled tight over sharp, angular bones, as though it had never known warmth or light. Its eyes, those golden, glowing eyes, burned into hers with an intensity that took her breath away. They weren't human, but something far older, darker, something that shouldn't exist. The creature's mouth split open in a grin, too wide to be natural. Rows of jagged teeth glinted in the beam of her flashlight, each one serrated like the blades of a butcher's knife. It exhaled, its breath fogging up the glass, and a low, guttural growl vibrated through the walls of the cabin. The sound wasn't just a growl. It was a laugh, a mocking, malevolent laugh that made Melanie's blood run cold. A primal instinct, buried deep inside her, surged to the surface. Her body finally obeyed. She bolted, throwing herself toward the door with frantic  Her hands were slick with sweat, fumbling with the bolt. but it slid open with a harsh scrape. She didn't pause to look back as she surged into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air bit into her skin, sharp and unyielding, but it couldn't chill the terror that burned in her chest. Her flashlight swung wildly in her hand, the beam slicing through the darkened night, casting erratic shadows against the trees. Behind her, the creature's pursuit was unmistakable. Its footsteps were heavy, uneven, each one landing with a sickening thud that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the thick underbrush catching at her legs, but she didn't dare slow down. Her car, the one thing that could take her out of this nightmare, was just ahead, a faint silhouette in the distance. Her heart surged with desperate hope, but as her gaze flickered to the ground, the bitter reality set in. Her keys were still inside the cabin. Panic rose, tightening its grip around her chest as she turned back toward the forest. The creature was there, standing at the edge of the trees, its golden eyes glowing like twin beacons in the dark. It didn't move, but the malicious grin on its face stretched wider, as if to say,
You can't escape.
Melanie's breath hitched, her vision blurred, her limbs weak with exhaustion and fear. She stumbled backward, her legs betraying her, but instinct kept her going. She turned away from the road, away from her car, and fled deeper into the woods. The forest seemed to close in around her like a trap, the trees whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The wind rustled the leaves, a haunting lullaby to the nightmare stalking her every step. The growl, low, rumbling, and unrelenting, followed her, each step she took pushing it farther away, but it was always there. It grew fainter, yes, but it was still there. A promise, a reminder. She wasn't safe. Not yet. When Melanie finally stumbled into town at dawn, her clothes were torn to tatters, and her hands were scraped raw, smeared with blood and dirt. She felt as though the night itself had clawed at her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but the unease in her stomach lingered, gnawing at her insides. As she staggered into the quiet town square, she looked up, half expecting to see the welcoming faces of the locals. Instead, the few people who were out at this early hour paused, their eyes flickering to her with expressions that shifted quickly from concern to suspicion. She tried to explain what had happened, how she'd gotten lost, how she'd run through the dark woods all night, but the crowd only exchanged knowing glances. Their expressions weren't laced with pity or even curiosity. It was something darker, like they already knew. You saw it, didn't you? One of them asked, her voice low but sharp, her eyes narrowing like a predator zeroing in. Saw what? Melanie demanded, a chill crawling up her spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. Before the woman could respond, an older man emerged from the crowd, his steps slow and deliberate, his face carved from stone. Melanie recognized him immediately. He had been there when she first arrived at the camp, the one who'd warned her to stay on the marked trails. His grim expression now sent a shiver through her. "The Wendigo," he said simply, his voice hushed, as though speaking its name aloud might summon it. "Once it's marked you, it never stops hunting." Melanie's stomach dropped. Her thoughts churned in disbelief, but her body betrayed her with a creeping wave of dread. She turned toward the forest, its dense shadows reaching out like dark, hungry fingers. The towering pines swayed unnaturally, as though alive, their movements synchronized with a faint, far-off growl that seemed to echo from deep within. The locals stood in silence, their faces void of emotion, but their eyes told a story, a warning she couldn't ignore. The weight of their unspoken words pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. The old man stepped closer, his gaze heavy with unspoken truths. The Wendigo only comes for those who are already lost, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And once it marks you, it never stops, no matter where you go. Melanie's breath hitched. Her mind reeled, rejecting the impossible. But her gut churned with a primal fear, the same fear she'd felt in the woods, when every sound had carried the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Slowly she nodded, stiffly stepping back from the crowd and away from the ominous forest. But as she moved, a cold breeze swept through the town, rattling the windows of nearby shops. Then she heard it. A faint, distant knocking. The hairs on her arms stood on end, and the air grew colder, as though the forest itself were calling her back. The days turned into weeks, and though she returned to the city, the safety it promised felt paper thin. Shadows flitted at the edges of her vision, quick, fleeting shapes that vanished when she turned to face them. At night, when the wind howled, the knocking would return. It started soft, like a faint tapping on wood, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it reverberated in her skull. She told herself it was her imagination, a lingering fear she couldn't quite shake. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the feeling only grew stronger. The sensation of being watched clung to her, heavy and suffocating. And each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows deepened, her eyes would drift towards the woods. The question haunted her, a whisper at the edge of her thoughts. Had she truly escaped? Deep within the pines, something stirred, waiting, watching, and it would never stop. What did you think of this short horror story? Comment or email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. A special shout out to Josh Bell for submitting this terrific story. Remember, you can follow both of his shows, Real Real Talk and Real Real Talk Horror, wherever you stream podcasts. As we turn down the lights on this episode, join me next time as I read another original short horror story. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.